I always have difficulty. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Talk a little bit louder? Okay. I always have difficulty with a Patty Limerick introduction because she's talking about, when she says she's talking about me, I don't know who she's talking about. That person is someone else as far as I'm concerned. But I am glad to be here. I am honored and flattered to follow Polly and giving this lecture and to do it so in the way that it honors the person who was the first African-American graduate of the University of Colorado. We're not going to speak much on her because you already heard the lecture, and Polly has an excellent book out that I encourage all of you to buy and read if you haven't already done so. But what we are going to do is something that, and this is a risk. Patty says I take risks. This is a risk tonight. We're going to talk about a website and how that website has changed African-American history or has the potential to change African-American history. And we're going to use examples, women, 6 women, who are reflective of the changes that have taken place or are taking place in terms of the website. But before I do that, before I get into, what we call the formal lecture, although it's not going to be a lecture, it's going to be more conversation than anything else, let me say something as a point of personal privilege. Patty Limerick is my friend. That's kind of an understatement. Patty and I, and she reminded me of this today, we've been friends for almost 30 years. We've grown old together. I've grown older faster than she has, but there have been a lot of years have passed. What is more important is that I don't think there's anybody else other than my own parents who are more responsible for my success as an academic. Patty Limerick is the person who encouraged me. She gave me support at crucial times. I'm here today speaking to you as the Bullitt Professor Emeritus, mainly because of a number of things that she did, including the book that we talked about, the book that she talked about, the In Search of the Racial Frontier, where, and I know maybe it's not proper to say this, but Patty, I took that book manuscript to Patty to have her publish it in her series. She refused. She, in turn, took it to her publisher, W.W. Norton, and as they say, the rest is history. That book transformed Western history, certainly African-American history, but most importantly, at least for me, transformed my life. And so, Patty, I want to say publicly, if I never get a chance to do this again, I want to say thank you for all that you've done for me. Thank you very, very much. Okay, as you can see from the screen above, and I have the screen in front of me as well, we're going to be talking about blackpass.org. And Patty's given me an opportunity to engage in some shameless self-promotion. This is our website, and this is quite literally our passion project. I was working on blackpass.org this morning before I came to the class that Patty arranged for me. I was working on it this afternoon. I will be working on it when I go back home after the lecture tonight. And I'm working on it because this is 6,000 pages of information on the African-American experience. And we are constantly adding information to that website every single day. According to Google, not me, according to Google, this is the largest website on African-American history on the internet today. And so we're very proud of the fact that we created something that I hope will last long after I'm no longer around. And it's dependent upon essentially the support of literally 800 volunteers from 6 continents. 800 volunteers from 6 continents. And if we're lucky tonight, maybe we'll have 801 from this audience. Maybe we'll have someone or maybe someones who will be willing to volunteer. But enough of that. Let me get into the lecture because I know we have a limited amount of time. Essentially, as I said before, this is a tribute to Lucile Berkeley Buchanan, a woman who went through extraordinary challenges in order to matriculate here at the University of Colorado. And even her graduation, as Polly knows, was problematic. Fortunately, we don't have that today. At least I hope we don't have that today. And we don't have that today precisely because she was a pioneer. And precisely because Mrs. Flowers was a pioneer. Those people who came before, those people who came when there was no one else here, very few people who were willing to come and put themselves in that situation. Those people are really the pioneers. They are the ones that we should be thankful for, because without them, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you tonight. Let me repeat that. Without them, without their bravery, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. So let me talk about Black Past for just a few minutes, and then I'll get into the real topic of our discussion, which is those 6 extraordinary women. Lucile Buchanan would normally be among those women, but since you talked about her last year, we decided to talk about some others. This is the Black Past mission statement, as Patty said. I won't spend a lot of time on it. She's done a great job on it. But essentially, we want to point out the fact that there are truths. There are multiple truths in terms of African American history, the Black experience. In other words, people interpret it in different ways, and we want to try to respect those interpretations. But the second part of this sentence, we want to try to infuse these truths into every American's identity in order to make our union more perfect and our society more just. What do we mean by that? What we mean, quite frankly, is that we're all connected. African American history may be one manifestation of that connection, but we are all connected. And so one of the reasons for Black Past is to try to make sure that we all understand those connections. I believe, and maybe I'm naive in this, but I believe if we begin to understand those connections, then a lot of what we call the racial tension that exists all over the country, including here in Boulder, that a lot of that will be challenged. I don't say it will be removed, but certainly it will be challenged. Black Past by the numbers. Patty's already talked about this. This is essentially a graphic which shows where we are. As Patty said, we have 1.8 million visitors, and there are people who are going on Black Past right now, including some people in this room, I see, who are going on Black Past right now, that we're going to increase that count. And we are on the verge. No, strike that. I was going to say we're on the verge of going to 31 million visitors for the life of the site. We've already passed that because I did these statistics 2 days ago. And given the fact that we get about 25 to 30,000 visitors a day, we've already surpassed those numbers. And so in a way, that's been both, how will I say this? It's been both an honor and a trap. It's an honor because it means that there are people who are using our work, but it's a trap in the sense that means we have to work even harder to make sure that Black Past is first rate. This is our social network. I don't know if you remember the film, The Social Network. This is our social network. We've done very well on Facebook. We haven't done as well on Twitter or Instagram. I don't even understand Instagram. It's for the kids. But nonetheless, we have a presence there. And this is all the work of people who like Black Past. We don't do this. We set up the pages, but essentially there are people who come to these pages and talk about information. In many instances, we will have more people who will visit our Black Past Facebook page after an entry's gone up than we have who actually visit the page on Black Past. We have a global reach. Since the beginning, this is right. Since January 1st, every country in the world has sent visitors to Black Past except 2, North Korea and the Central African Republic. We think that there are probably some technical issues involved with the Central African Republic. We don't know what's going on with North Korea. And let me explain this photograph. We did this entry on Dennis. We didn't do it on North Korea. We did it on Dennis Rodman, okay? And we used this picture because we thought this was an apt photograph to use. And we didn't get any hits or any visits directly from North Korea as far as we could tell, but we did get an email contact from a North Korean public relations firm, and they said, quite frankly, we know about you. They didn't say they liked what we said. They didn't say they were opposed to what we said. They didn't say that we had a problem with showing this photograph. They just wanted us to know that they knew about us. So somebody in North Korea is using or at least monitoring blackpast.org. This man, even more than me, should take the credit for founding Black Past. He's George Tamlin. He's a former TA, my former TA. He came up with the idea, I'll do the story quickly. He came up with the idea of essentially having information on my faculty website that would help people understand African American history. We taught African American history, the survey, and we would spend time talking about the background of Malcolm X or the background of Martin Luther King. And he said, why don't you put the background on your faculty website? Why don't you put, vignettes on your faculty website? Naturally, being an academic who didn't trust the internet, I resisted. And he finally broke down my resistance, and he actually wrote vignettes. I think something like 25 or 30 vignettes that we put on my faculty website, and we literally forgot about it. 1 year later, I got an email from a young lady, and it was clear from the email that she was a high school student. And she said, I have these 12 questions about African American history that I'd like you to answer. And I said, I'm not going to answer 12 questions over email. Why don't you come to my office and we'll talk about it? I didn't hear from her for 24 hours. Then she wrote back and said, I can't come to your office. I live in New Zealand. And at that point, I realized that the World Wide Web is not just hype, that indeed this information is actually going around the world. We failed to gate or to restrict the information to the University of Washington or to my students, and the information was flowing. And this was the first contact I had with the outside world, but it wouldn't be the last. Let me explain what would happen. About 3 months later, I got an email from someone who purported to be from the U.S. State Department. And he said, people in Russia, more specifically, people in Siberia have discovered your website, and they want you to come and give lectures on African American history in Siberia. Then he asked for my passport number and my bank account number. And I said, wait a minute, this is a scam. This is not good. And so I'm thinking that this is something I should dismiss. And then I thought, maybe there's something to this. Maybe there is a possibility here. And so I contacted the person who knew someone in the FBI. They in turn contacted the guy who wrote the email. He in fact was from or is from the State Department. And 2 months later, I was in Siberia. Now, I told the State Department people, I said, I don't mind you sending me to Siberia. You just make sure you bring me back. And as a consequence, we gave a series of lectures for about half a month in 2005 in Siberia. And those students were amazing. They knew African American history, and they wanted to learn more, and they were already using our faculty website. And it's at that point that we decided maybe we should come back and take this whole process much more seriously than we had up until that point. And so after the Siberia trip, we officially launched blackpass.org on February 1st, 2007. You can see the founders present. You can see the people who were there at that particular time. I'll move a little bit faster. How are we going to organize this site? We actually had no master plan. We had nothing popped up except that we wanted to do entries that were much more elaborate than the vignettes of a couple hundred words that we had used before. And so we began to cast these encyclopedia entries. I'll talk about them in a minute. But this is the original homepage. Blackpass doesn't look like this anymore, but I don't know how to do screen capture, so I have to use the old version that somebody else did for me. But this is the original version of the website. And you can see the planes off in the side. Those are Tuskegee Airmen. They're flying a training mission, and we'll talk more about the Tuskegee Airmen later. This is a typical encyclopedia entry. I can't even see who he is. Can anybody tell who he is? Who? Ernest Wilkins. How many of you have heard of Ernest Wilkins? Good. Ernest Wilkins was one of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project. How many of you know that there were 8 scientists and 12 black technicians, 8 black scientists and 12 black technicians who worked on the Manhattan Project? How many of you knew that before today? I have mixed feelings. She knew. I have mixed feelings about this because the Manhattan Project also introduces us into the atomic age and with all of its issues. But nonetheless, these were the men who were present. These were the men who were involved. We decided to go international very quickly. Blackpass is primarily a website on African American history, but we wanted to show that there was an African presence all over the world. And so it's obvious that we do Africa, but we wanted to also show people of African ancestry elsewhere. And so these are just a couple of the examples. And I would say maybe 20% of the entries that we have on Black Past are on people who are outside the United States. This is excuse me? Yes. Was it Brahms as well? Brahms, Black? No, he wasn't, but there were people who worked with him. Yeah, but there were, and this is one of the things we wanted to do. We want to make sure that people have accurate information. And that's what we verify everything. We literally verify everything on Black Past because it's so important. How many people knew about Thomas Alexander Dumas, the father of Alexander Dumas, the Three Musketeers? More importantly, how many of you knew about Abram Petrovich Hannibal, the great-grandfather of Alexander Pushkin? These are the characters. These are the people who make up this history that so far and for so long has been ignored. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, I was just raising my hand to say I knew.
Oh, okay. He knew. Black Past exists because we have contributors. We have 800 people from around the world, and literally around the world. We have people from, there are 7 continents. We have people from 6 continents who write for Black Past. We haven't gotten the penguins to write anything yet from Antarctica, but we do cover Antarctica, okay? And these are some of our contributors. They fall into 3 broad categories. Some of them are academic contributors. We're trying to get Patty on the website. She knows that. We have what are known as student contributors. And at this point, I'm going to embarrass her and ask Alexandria to stand up, Alexandria Laird to stand up. She's one of our latest student contributors. You'll see her entries yes, give her a hand. She's one of those 800 people who've written for Black Past. And we want to, as I said, we want to have others as well. And then we have what are known as independent historians. And the independent historians essentially, I'm sorry. Polly was on Black Past years before Alexandria. Polly, wave your hand. Come on. Okay. She's we've gotten to a point now where there are few occasions where I can walk into a room, certainly with academics or students, and not find someone who's made a contribution to Black Past. And we love that. We love that because we want Black Past to be a vehicle for the telling of the history of African Americans and people of African ancestry by folks all around the world, and we will continue to do that. And speaking of which, we have international contributors. These are 2, Jacques Portes, Paris University, and Kazuo, I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name, but she's at the University of Tokyo. These are just a few of the many independent historians and others. Well, these are actually academic historians, but historians from a variety of cultures and circumstances and backgrounds who write for Black Past. Couple of contributor records. This is Dwayne Mack. Dwayne is from Berea College. He wrote the entry, The Freedom Rides, which at the last time we checked had 300,000 visitors, or 300,000 people have read that entry. And James Banks, my colleague, he wrote I Remember Brown. Actually, I think I overestimated the number of people that have read his entry. It's 87, probably 88,000 now. We have speeches that are both on African American or by African Americans and about African Americans. I should say this, and I say it with some trepidation. We have a speech by George Wallace called Segregation Now and Segregation Forever, because it deals with race. And we need to understand exactly the thinking of people like Wallace. We also have the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens. And unless you're a Civil War historian, you wouldn't be familiar with this. The cornerstone speech essentially said that the Civil War was being fought over the question of slavery. There are historians who've debated this. All they had to do was go back to the source, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, who said front and center, this is about preserving slavery. And so rather than get into those debates about what people said, we put the documents online. We make the documents available so that people can make their own minds. This is a global African history speech by Benjamin Ezekwe. This is an African American history primary document, and quite frankly, I can't even read it. Can somebody tell me what the title is? New Mexico Civil Rights Act. How many of you know that New Mexico passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1950s? How many of you know that New Mexico's Civil Rights Act passed in the 1950s was the partial basis for the National Civil Rights Act of 1964? And essentially, we talk about the young men, the young graduate students, black graduate students at the University of New Mexico that eventually pushed for this legislation and how that had a ripple effect that eventually impacted the entire country. This is our African American history timeline. Timelines are important. They're quick ways to find out a lot of information, and so we spend a lot of time on this. And Google says the timelines are the most popular aspect of Black Past. We also have perspectives articles where we go beyond the 500 or 600 word entry, and we have often historians write about questions of race or ethnicity, and these articles go out to a broad audience because we want people to know that African American history is not just the sum total of a number of vignettes, that indeed there are major questions that have to be addressed, and we are trying to address those questions in Black Past. For instance, you probably know about the Reconstruction series that's going on television right now. We've got someone lined up to write about Reconstruction after the Civil War for Black Past. And of course, we have links, off-site links to all kinds of websites. We'll show a couple of these. This is for teachers. Oh, this is a cool one. This is the Atlanta Daily World. I don't know how many of you know that the Atlanta Daily World is one of the leading black newspapers in the country. Now, this is a link. You just see a page here. If you were to go to the website and click on that page, you would see the Atlanta Daily World for April 18th, 2019. In other words, you would see the front page of the current newspaper, okay? And we do this for all of the major black newspapers in the country. Those of you who have your cell phones, you can go to them right now and you can see the Atlanta Daily World. But we also have links to all of the major African and West Indian newspapers all around the world. And you can go to your cell phones and you can see what's on the front page of the Journal de Angola. In other words, we want people to know not just the history, but what is going on, what is the current situation in a whole host of countries around the world. Charles Wright Museum. Next to the National Museum in Washington, D.C., this is probably the leading African-American museum. We have 150 black museums in the United States connected on Black Past. Just go to the page for museums, link on. But we also have at least 40 museums dealing with Africa, Africans, slavery from around the world. This is the House of Slaves, Goree Island, Senegal. Anybody in here been to Senegal, been to Goree Island? A couple of people. You guys know what I'm going to show next, and I'm going to let you explain it. Do you know what that is? Go ahead.
That's the portal in which enslaved people were taken out to slavery.
That's right. That's very, very powerful. A lot of people have stood there, Clinton, Barack Obama. I've stood there. I mean, it's a very moving, very powerful sight because essentially it's the last point at which people of African ancestry are able to see their homeland because they're taken out the ships and then they're brought to the New World. We want to remember. We need to remember that, and we use Black Past as a vehicle to help us remember. We also have links to every African-American, let me say this properly, historically black college and university in the country. Let me repeat that. We have links to every historically black college and university in the country. So you want to know what those institutions are, what they're doing. If you want to know their history, go to Black Past. This is very old, but this is our original Facebook page. And if you can see the numbers, again, I don't have my glasses. I can't see the numbers. I think we had like 5,000 visitors or followers on Facebook then. Now we got 350,000. And we have the same thing for Twitter, although we haven't been as successful with Twitter as we have with Facebook. But the idea here is that social media, and again, I'm one of those people who resisted this notion at first. Social media is extremely important in terms of spreading the history, not just of African Americans, but all folks. Let me say something before we get into the actual 6 women who changed African American history. I guess the best way to say this is that we have come to learn, we didn't start out intentionally thinking this, but we've come to learn that Black Pass is not just the best vehicle, it's almost the only vehicle for expanding our universe of African American history. I'm going to say this, and I say this with no malice to people who have traditionally taught African American history or who've traditionally been involved with Black History Month celebrations, but we tend to focus on what I call the 100 most famous African Americans. You know, the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's, the Fannie Lou Hamers. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And certainly we have all of those people on Black Pass. But what I think is the genius of Black Pass is that we go far beyond those 100 people, that we have thousands of people who reflect on that history. And the folks that I'm going to share with you tonight are just those kinds of people who have not gotten a great deal of attention. I hope they will get more as a result of this presentation. So let's begin. We start with Isabel de Oliveira. How many of you have heard of her? Patty has, because she's heard other lectures. Isabel de Oliveira, let me pull this up. Anybody want to read this? Because it's hard, again, it's hard for me to read the small print. Anybody want to read this? I'm going to test your reading skills. The gentleman in the tie. Okay. Mm-hmm. David. Mm-hmm.
Showing that I am a free woman, unmarried, and legitimate daughter of Fernando, a Negro and an Indian named Magdalena.
Mm-hmm.
I demand justice.
Okay. There are a number of things going on here. Let me try to unpack some of them. First of all, that statement, I demand justice, is precious to me, because that is, as far as we know, the first time someone has said, I want my full rights in what will become the United States. Not even the United States at that time. It's actually still Mexico, actually Spanish Mexico at that time. And in some ways, I know this is bold and maybe over the top, but I consider that the civil rights movement that we all know and talk about begins with this statement. In other words, she demands justice, and that struggle for justice continues right to this very day. There's something else that's going on as well. Isabel de Oliveira is part of an advance guard of people of Spanish language, Spanish culture, who come from central Mexico, who arrive in what is now the American Southwest. And in the case of Isabel de Oliveira, she arrives in 1600. That's 19 years before the first blacks arrive at Jamestown. How many of you know about African American history and know that we usually start in 1619 with Jamestown? I'm not saying forget about Jamestown. He knows. I'm not saying forget about Jamestown. I'm saying expand your focus. Understand that there were black people in this area of the country. How far is Albuquerque? How far is Santa Fe from here? There were black people in this area of the country long before. Yeah, it's 400 years or more. And essentially what Isabel de Oliveira represents is that wave of African American, I didn't call them African American, that wave of black people who come up from central Mexico. Yes, they are Spanish speakers, they're Spanish in culture. Look at the population of New Spain, and you can go down the list and look at the number of mulattoes. And by mulattoes, we mean people who are mixed blood, mixed ancestry, not just between the Spaniards, the white Spaniards and blacks, but also between Native Americans. Look at that. 10% of the population of New Spain in 1793 is of black ancestry. And those are the people who will come and populate the area of the country that we sometimes call Colorado, and that we certainly call New Mexico, and we certainly call California, and we certainly call Arizona, and on and on and on. These are some pictures of some of these folks. These are artist renderings of these black folks from central Mexico. This is the percentage of blacks and mulattoes in various northern New Spain cities. These are higher percentages than of the black population in some of these places right now. Look at Albuquerque. Albuquerque is nowhere near 24% black. Okay. And go all the way down the list. Look at Los Angeles. More than half of the founders of Los Angeles were people who look like me. I want you to think about that. More than half of the founders of the modern city of Los Angeles were people who look like me. This is the diorama put up by the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum, and you can see the early settlers as they march north to Los Angeles. This is a close-up, founders of LA. We don't have time to go into this now, but the point here is that all of these are black people who come to what we now call the American Southwest. They are the pioneers. They are the people who fundamentally shape and change American history in this region of the country. I wish we had more time to go into how this impacts the Mexican War, how this impacts the way in which Mexicans are looked upon, because Mexicans in some ways are looked upon as a mulatto race precisely because of this huge black presence. Let me give you some figures to put this in perspective. I know I'm talking too long, but let me give you some figures. We know that 350,000 African slaves were brought to British North America. And we know that there are, 40 million blacks who are mostly descendants of those 350,000 black slaves. What we probably don't know is that there were 200,000 black slaves that were brought to Mexico, just Mexico alone. And the difference, the fundamental difference, is that most of those people were absorbed into the population, so that when you do DNA studies on people of Mexican ancestry, it's hard to find someone whose black blood doesn't show up, or black DNA doesn't show up. There's a very different history. I mean, we talk about the racial history in America, and, we talk about it. We need to talk about it. Let's understand that the racial history in America is not the racial history of the world. That indeed, when we think about race in America, there are only two other societies that I can think of that are pretty well gone down this path. One of them is what we call South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And can anybody think of the other one? Anybody? Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany. Almost all of the Nuremberg laws that were designed to control the Jewish population and all the, quote, non-Germans came from the American South. Think about that, came from the American South. No, that's not a coincidence. That was done on purpose. So understand that race, when it's defined in America, it's important, and we need to understand that. But we also need to see the rest of the world so we can understand how race functions in those areas as well. That's not to say that everybody else is perfect. Far from it. After all, Isabel de Oliveira had to issue her statement saying, "I demand justice." But demanding justice in the Mexican context is different from demanding justice in Virginia. And nobody demanded, of those 19 blacks, nobody demanded justice in Virginia at that particular time. Let me move on. We've got others. Bridget Biddy Mason. How many of you heard of her? Okay, good. Then my work is successful here. Bridget Biddy Mason was a black slave of a Mormon slaveholder. And I'm getting ahead of myself in the story, but essentially she is brought from Mississippi to Nauvoo, and where is Nauvoo? Is it in Illinois? In Illinois, and then on to winter camp in Iowa, and then finally out to the Salt Lake Valley. She arrives in the Salt Lake Valley a year after Brigham Young and the initial party arrived. And so essentially what happens is that there's slavery among the Mormons early on. And here's another, this is an enslaved couple. This is Green Flake. I know you guys have never heard of Green Flake. He was the driver for Brigham Young. Everybody talks about that moment when Brigham Young arrives and he says, "This is the place," when he talks about finding the Salt Lake Valley. The guy on the right, Green Flake, actually went ahead of him, and he was the first one to see the valley. Okay, and then Brigham Young comes along, and all the rest of the Mormon pioneers. You cannot divorce Mormon history or LDS history from African Americans. This is an early example of this. This is an act in relation to service passed by the Utah Territorial Legislature. This is a Utah slave code. This is a Utah slave code. And I want you, I'm not going to ask anybody to read it because we're already behind time, but look at how the slaves are to be treated in Utah territory, as opposed to elsewhere. I really love number 6. But let's bring all of this back to Bridget Mason, because she's the one that we want to focus on. Bridget Mason, as I said, is a slave. And as a slave, she's told by Brigham Young to go to a place called San Bernardino. I know you guys have heard of San Bernardino. San Bernardino, the Mormons created Las Vegas. I still have a hard time reconciling that. But they also created San Bernardino. And they created both of these towns as way stations for the eventual Mormon movement, the movement of Mormons from around the world through Southern California up to Salt Lake, up to the Salt Lake Valley. And her owner, Robert Smith, was supposed to be part of that effort to try to create the path from Southern California up to Salt Lake. Bridget Mason had other ideas. When she moved, when she was taken on the trail to California, she learned that California was a free state. And therefore, she decided that once she got to California, she was going to sue for her freedom. And she did. And essentially, the case went to court. And this is the decision of Judge Benjamin Hayes, Los Angeles District Court, January 19th, 1856. He frees her and her entire family. In other words, this is an example of a person who challenges slavery, Mormon slavery, but nonetheless who challenges slavery and becomes free. The story doesn't end there. This is the Bridget Biddy Mason Memorial. If you guys ever go to Los Angeles, and I know a lot of you will, I know a lot of you have been, go to the Ronald Reagan Federal Building. Go across the street. This is where this memorial is. Because this is where the Bridget Mason homestead was. And let me explain what I mean by why that's significant. Mason settles in Los Angeles. She homesteads land. She's an urban homesteader. And through no fault of her own, she takes advantage of the rapid growth of Los Angeles as a city. And you can see the population increases. And of course, the black population increases as well. And Bridget Mason becomes kind of a founding mother for the African-American community in Los Angeles. And let me give you a couple of examples. This is the Mason family on their front porch. I'll fast forward. This is First AME Church. First AME Church in Los Angeles is the largest black church in the city to this day. Yeah, it hosts a whole lot of famous people. Okay. This is the church that she founded. And she founded it and she supported it with funds from her own pocket, essentially because, as she said, she wanted to hold it for her people. And essentially, as Los Angeles grows, the Mason-owned property grows in value. And eventually, she becomes a millionaire. Not by any strenuous effort, simply by the fact that she was there early enough at the right time. And she becomes one of the leading philanthropists, not just for black folks, but for everybody in Los Angeles at that time. This is the Mason Owen block in 1920. This is her grandson, Robert C. Owens. Tragic story, 1929, stock market crash. He loses everything. And that's the end of the Mason Owens legacy. There are some descendants who are still around, but certainly they no longer have the wealth that they did up until that time. But Bridget Mason was a town founder. She was one of the founders of modern Los Angeles and admitted by the elders of Los Angeles as such. Harriet Redmond. I bet you haven't heard of her. Okay, I'm in good company here because I hadn't heard of her until we did the research on Black Past. Harriet Hattie Redmond is from Portland, Oregon. And she's significant because she was part of the suffragette movement in Oregon. We usually think of the suffragette movement as essentially white women, especially outside of the South or outside of the East, that this is a white woman's movement. But Harriet Redmond, as you're going to see in a minute, injects herself into that campaign, and here we are. There are 3 leaders of the campaign in Oregon in 1912. By the way, women win the right to vote in Oregon in 1912 because of the efforts of these three. Abigail Scott Duniway, you probably know about her. She is by far the paramount figure in this campaign. There's also Emma Wold. For those of you who are college students, understand that college students were instrumental in the campaign to get women the right to vote in Oregon in 1912. But look at the third one, Harriet Redmond. She is the founder of the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage Association. It's a tiny group, but it's a group that was respected by all of the suffragettes throughout Oregon, and she is listed as one of the three major leaders to bring about the vote for women. These are some of the clippings that reflect on her efforts. Now, let me say this. There was a lot of opposition in the black community, the black male community, to her and what she was doing, because a lot of black men didn't want African-American women to vote at that time, just like a lot of men didn't want women to vote at that time. But she overcame a lot of that opposition, or she ignored it, and she continued to push for votes, not just for colored women, but for all women. Anybody want to read this statement? Give me a chance to rest here. Anybody want to read this out loud? Go ahead.
Biographer of Redmond, 2015. The campaign for women's right to vote reflected Redmond's belief that United States citizenship belonged to all women and that obstacles such as being African American in a racist city would not, I think it means, slow her down. She fought for the franchise for all women and never feared that audiences, black or white, male or female, rich or poor, would trivialize what she had to say because she was a working class woman.
This is powerful stuff. This, again, all kinds of things to unpack here. First of all, this is a woman who interjects herself into an overwhelmingly white female campaign, and she's successful. She integrates herself into that campaign. She becomes a major leader. She brings along her community, but she also fights for, is successful in getting the right to vote for all women in Oregon at that particular time. Juanita Jewel Shanks Craft, long name. Actually, a long history. This is a remarkable woman. She's from Texas. You can see her long life, 1902, 1985. She's born in Austin, Texas, but she quickly leaves Austin and she settles. This is young Juanita. She settles in what is probably the most racially challenged city in all of Texas at that time, Dallas. Dallas is bad, guys. Dallas is bad. Dallas had public lynchings of black folks as late as 1920 in downtown. I don't mean on the edge of town. I mean in downtown Dallas. And she moves into this environment, and she immediately becomes a civil rights activist. She begins to campaign for better housing in the slums of Dallas for African Americans. She also takes on segregated Dallas streetcars, which is a major challenge. Almost everything in Dallas was segregated at that time. But she's probably most noted, or at least I'm going to note her most, for this, Smith versus Allwright. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. This is the Supreme Court decision that gave black people in Texas the right to vote in 1944. She was the mastermind of this campaign to eventually get black women the right to vote that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Here she is with national NAACP leaders, which shows her clout. She's standing next to Walter White, and I don't know if you guys know who Walter White is, but he was the executive director, the longtime executive director of the NAACP. See the guy standing in the background? That's Thurgood Marshall. These were her friends. These were her contemporaries. Thurgood Marshall said that she led the most powerful NAACP of any state NAACP in the country. In the country. Again, this is a remarkable woman, and she doesn't stop there. 1950, Sweat v. Painter. This was a Supreme Court case that involved blacks getting into the University of Texas because blacks were excluded from the University of Texas. She's behind this effort, the effort that eventually goes to the Supreme Court. And, of course, there's the integration of the University of Texas Law School and eventually all of the University of Texas. She's behind the theater protests in the 1950s. You can see her on the right. She's actually picketing at the Texas State Fair because the Texas State Fair had a tradition of Negro Day. In other words, blacks could only go to the fair one day of the week. Actually, that's all over the South. I remember Negro Day in Brownsville, Tennessee, but we won't get into that. And she was steadfast in her opposition and finally broke that down. 1976, she's the first black person elected to the Dallas City Council. And she is amazing. She's still a radical. Let me show you this. I know we got a lot to cover. This is the Juanita Shanks Craft home. Sometimes you can find interesting information in strange places. This is her home. And this is the write-up about her home, which is now a museum, by the way. It's a museum in Dallas, Texas, and you can go and you can see it. Anybody want to read that? I know it's small print.
Juanita Shanks Craft Home, 1990, City of Dallas. About the Juanita Craft Home. Juanita Craft was an NAACP leader, former Democratic precinct chair, and the first black woman in Texas history to be deputized as a poll tax collector. She moved to this Warren Avenue home during the 1950s when racial tension in the neighborhood was high. There were 11 bombings in the surrounding area from 1950 to 1951 alone. Despite this, her home became a meeting place for African-American youth whom Craft educated on civil rights issues and believed would shape the future of the civil rights struggle.
Wow, thank you for reading that. Understand this woman. I mean, understand the house. The house is a cool house and it's a museum now. But understand this woman. She devoted her entire life, her entire career, quote unquote, to civil rights. And she never retired. She never really retired from the struggle. She never really said, I've done enough and I'm walking away from it. We need more information on people like Juanita Shanks Craft. Now, let's get local. Let's get local. How many of you have heard of Rachel B. Knowles? Oh, a few people. Okay. So let's talk about her for a minute. And maybe I'll let you guys talk about it because you probably know as much as I do. Rachel Knowles was born on January 15, 1980. Well, you can read this. She is the first black woman elected to public office in Colorado in 1965. For that, she should be noted as a historical figure. But that's just the beginning. That's not the end. That's just the beginning. And the beginning goes back to Barrett Elementary School in East Denver. Let me try to set this up. Let me try to explain it. Barrett Elementary School was opened in 1960, and Rachel Knowles was appalled that it was open. Not because there wasn't a need for elementary schools, but because this was clearly designed to be a segregated school. It was designed to be in the middle of the black community, the hood, if whatever you want to call it. And she came to believe, and that this simply perpetuates segregation, racial segregation. So she's finally elected to the Denver School Board in 1965, and she becomes the leading advocate for school integration. She says that well, I'll let you read what she says. I'll let you read it. In other words, she's going against the grain. And this is not something unique. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of black folks, there are a lot of white folks who said that integrated schools ought to work and should be imposed. And when people of different races get together, they know each other, it reduces tension. We all know that. That's what she advocated on the school board. She was, for the most part, a lone voice. Very, very few people saw the situation that she did until April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And at that point, and you can say it's opportunistic, I don't know how you want to describe it. At that point, she decided that this is the moment that we ought to do something about segregation in Denver. And so essentially, she crafted what would be known as Denver School Board Resolution number 1490, the Knowles Resolution. And I won't read it. I won't have you guys read it because we're behind in time. It called for the desegregation of Denver public schools. This is the first public effort to desegregate the schools in Denver, Colorado. Let me repeat that, the first public effort to desegregate those schools. And she talks about the implementation of the policy. And I want somebody to read this, because essentially this is part of the Knowles Resolution. It gets very personal, but it's part of the resolution. Anybody want to read that? Anybody want to read that out loud? Miss, go ahead.
The death of Dr. Martin Luther King has focused the attention of concerned people of goodwill upon the deep and festering injustices of modern urban existence. With its contradictions of opportunity and achievement in an American dedicated, at least in theory, to the equality of opportunities for all men, particularly in the area of public education. Dr. King's death has caused thoughtful persons of all races, particularly white, to reassess beliefs long and dearly held, and to question the pace of change and even its direction.
Yeah, this is powerful stuff. And it was placed inside the resolution. She wrote the resolution, essentially. The resolution is adopted by the Denver Public School Board. Nobody expected that, but it was adopted by the school board. They were on record now as being in favor of racial integration or desegregation. Now, this is a school board that had dragged its feet for a number of years, and now, because of King's death, they're trying to do something to erase this, to challenge this issue. This resolution was adopted. Let's go back. It was adopted on April 25th, so in the shadow of the King assassination. So it looks like the city of Denver is committed to racial integration. This is no resolution. Can somebody read this very quickly? This is very wordy. Anybody want to read this quickly? Go ahead.
I was calmer than I had ever been. I felt this was so important that the opportunity should not be missed. I knew I had support from my community and from many whites too. All those years, so little had been done to promote quality education for Black and brown students. In those times, 1968, after the assassination of King, there was a feeling of high morality across the country about consideration of Black people and all the wrongs against our schools and our children.
Wow. The story continues. The struggle for school desegregation in Denver, beginning in 1968, formally in 1960. You could go back even farther than that, but this at the no resolution puts everybody on alert, puts everything on the table, so to speak. And you can see her supporters. And she does have supporters, including supporters in the white community. But you can also see the opposition. Buses are burned in Denver in order to make sure that there's no desegregation, no effective desegregation. She says, everyone associates me with busing. I never spoke about busing. It's a model of transportation. That's all. My stand was for equal educational opportunity for all children, not for minorities to be in a segregated afterthought status. If it took a bus to desegregate, then so be it. In other words, the battle was joined. In other words, Denver was convulsed in this debate. Well, maybe that's too weak a word, in this struggle over desegregation. And there was a lot of tension. There were a lot of death threats directed at her and those who supported racial integration. You can see the burning of the buses. But the case, the no resolution, and the idea of whether the Denver School Board can actually have the authority to desegregate the schools, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in the famous decision, Keys versus School District Number 1, upheld the no resolution. In other words, the U.S. Supreme Court said that there ought to be desegregation of the schools. Now, what's significant about this is that you can see it here. This is the first desegregation case outside of the South. This is the first major desegregation ruling by the Supreme Court outside of the South. This is her victory, or at least it should be. The Rachel Noel legacy continues. This is too small, but 1969, she's appointed assistant professor of sociology at Metropolitan State College. She eventually they create the Noel Distinguished Professorship. In 1976, Governor Dick Lamb, I'll summarize this, makes her the first CU regent, the first Black regent for the University of Colorado. In 1978, she's elected to a full term. 1990, the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award. She receives an honorary doctorate of public service from CU Boulder, and on and on and on. But look at that last one. In 2013, the Rachel B. Noel High School was opened in Northwest Denver. Do you understand the contradiction here? Anybody understand the contradiction? The contradiction is this woman had worked all of her life to try to facilitate equal opportunity and school integration, and they build a school named after her in the middle of the hood. And that's actually the second school that was named after her. And in effect, it sort of symbolizes, I'm sorry to say, it symbolizes the failure of school desegregation in Denver. Denver schools are almost as segregated now as they were in 1965 or 1969. You know, I wish we could always say that there's a happy ending for all of these stories about people who struggle. And in many instances there is. But there's a tragic ending for Rachel Knowles. She worked all of her life. She devoted all of her energy. She took all of these threats from people who didn't like what she wanted to do in terms of quality education, who didn't want what you see in this room right now. There are black people and white people in this room. There are people of color in this room who are sitting with white folks. We don't get upset at that. But apparently the idea of that happening in the public schools in Denver was way too much for a lot of people to accept. And as a result, the schools remain segregated to this day. As we said before, I wish we could end this with a happy note, but unfortunately, in the case of Rachel Lowell, that legacy is very much mixed. She wanted to do the right thing. I think she did the right thing, but ultimately there were forces that were too large and too powerful that were arrayed against her that undermined what she attempted to do. Okay. We're getting toward the end. This is the last of the 6, guys. I know I'm wearing you out. I'm wearing me out if I'm not wearing you out. Carolyn Downs. This is from my hometown, Seattle. Carolyn Downs, as you can see, died very, very young. Let me talk about her, and this is going to be relatively short. Carolyn Downs is most noted as a Black Panther, a woman who joined the Black Panther Party, and I'll explain how that happened in Seattle. First of all, she was a child in a family of 16. Yes, 16. She came north with her family from Texas. She eventually enrolled in the Seattle public schools. But she came at a time when Seattle was going through a civil rights movement. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the fact that there is a civil rights movement outside of the South. And Seattle was very much in the vortex of that movement in the early and mid 1960s. But by the late 1960s, a new force emerged called the Seattle Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party, which you can see lasted from 68 to 1977, had a new agenda. They were not concerned with desegregation. They were concerned with what they call building up and protecting the African American community. Now, you might think of the Panthers as all those guys with leather jackets, carrying the guns, and all the rest of that, all the bravado. And they had that. There's no question about it. But let me suggest to you that the Panthers were also community organizers and community builders. They were ones who started the free breakfast programs and the clinics and all across the country. I'll come back to Carolyn Downs in a minute. But I want to go back to something here. You remember, or you may not remember, that J. Edgar Hoover said that the Black Panther Party represents the greatest domestic threat to American society. Do you guys vaguely remember that, his famous statement? Most people assume that it was because the Black Panthers carried guns and they were confronting the police. No, that wasn't the case. Hoover knew, let's be frank, Hoover knew that the military forces, the police forces, could take care of the few Panthers who could challenge the police directly. And of course, a lot of Panthers died because of that. This is what they were afraid of. J. Edgar Hoover said that if the Panthers get away with these kinds of community programs, they will fundamentally radicalize African Americans all over the country. This is what he was afraid of, not the guns. Remember that, not the guns, but this. And essentially what the Panthers were doing was essentially creating these kinds of programs all over the country, including in Seattle. And one of the leading figures, let me jump forward, one of the leading figures for this in Seattle was a young woman who became involved with the Panthers at the age of 17, and she worked in the Sidney Miller Clinic. And you can see what she did: sickle cell anemia testing, high blood pressure testing, blood screening. This is not confronting the police, but as J. Edgar Hoover says, this is far more dangerous because she's talking about providing services where services weren't provided before. You know, she also works with the free breakfast program, free food program, et cetera, et cetera. Women of the Seattle Black Panther Party. Again, we think of the Panthers as mostly men. Eventually, the majority of the Panthers, and I want you to hear me carefully, the majority of the Panthers were going to be women. Eventually, the majority of the Panthers were going to be women. And those were the women who were going to be involved in delivering these kinds of services. And that's what made Hoover and the FBI and the others so very crazy. So you can see Carolyn Downs included in 1974. She joined the party in 74. And as I said, sometimes things don't go as you would like them to go. Beginning in 1975, Downs and other members of the party, Seattle Party, began campaigning for a permanent structure in Seattle to house a clinic, the first clinic for poor people in Seattle, the first clinic, and it's founded by the Panthers. It's essentially founded by Carolyn Downs. And they eventually get a grant from the U.S. government, of all people. They get a grant in 1977 from the National Health Service to create this clinic. Downs, of course, as you can see, dies of cervical cancer in 1978 before the clinic is finished. And at that point, as people know that she's dying, and by the way, I don't know how many of you know about cervical cancer, but this is one of the cancers that can be screened for and that can be prevented. In other words, she died. She died because she didn't get the medical care that she was hoping that others would receive with the creation of that clinic and with other programs by the Panthers. And so it's not an accident. It's not all that unusual that the Panthers would, in turn, name the building, the new community clinic, the Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center. Folks, it's still standing in Seattle. It's still delivering services. I think it will be around for a long time. It's the legacy of this remarkable woman. It's the legacy of this one. This is one of those women that most people don't know about. Most people, even in Seattle, haven't heard about it, even though they know about the Carolyn Downs Center. You can see the patients at the center. Ironically, most of the patients are other people of color. They're not even black. But she wouldn't have cared about that because she would have cared about the idea of delivering services to the poorest of the poor. And what I'm going to do here is take another risk and suggest to you that the Carolyn Downs legacy and the Panther legacy lives on in a very, very different way. Now, think about this. The Panthers were some of the first people, if not the first people in the country, that said health care is a right, who said that there ought to be a way in which all of society can take care of the health of all of the rest of society. And that's why the Panthers started these medical programs. That was considered radical in the 1960s. Indeed, that was considered crazy and scary in the 1960s. But look at this. This is the legacy of the Panthers. I know. Connect the dots, guys. Everybody is talking, I shouldn't say everybody. A lot of Democratic candidates are talking about Medicare for all. Medicare for all comes out of that dream of the Panthers. Not the Panthers aren't alone in this, but it comes out of that dream of a lot of people who say, maybe it's time for us to have a national health care system. Maybe it's time for us to make sure that poor people are not deprived of medical care precisely because they're poor. That's the Panther legacy. That's the Carolyn Downs legacy. And none of these people have heard of Carolyn Downs. I can assure you of that, okay? But they owe a debt of gratitude to her for what she did and what she attempted to change in terms of Seattle and eventually all of American society. And that's why we include her, and that's why we include Isabel de Oliveira, and that's why we include all 6 of these women. These are trailblazers. These are people who made history. These are people who changed lives, not only at the moment, but who continue to have an impact right to this day. And yet most of you, most of us had never heard of them until Black Pass came along. That's the Black Pass legacy. We aren't changing lives per se, but we're trying to make sure that those who are changing lives, that their stories are going to be known to the entire world. Thank you very much.